Good,
So-
good, good, good.
Let me check if it's there. Because the last time we did this, it didn't show. So we just want to make sure
I think we're live.
you're live.
Yes.
That's beautiful. Okay. Let me see. Yes, we are live. Okay. So welcome. Welcome, Xoli, and welcome our guests. Jack is here. I saw Antobeka was joining, or there she is. She joined again. Let me check. Jack is here. I saw Antobeka was joining, or there she is. She joined again. Let me check. Jack is here. I saw Antobeka was joining, or there she is. She joined again. Let me check. Jack is here. I saw Antobeka was joining.
Maybe you could try silencing your Facebook page, Tina.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. This.
Maybe you try silencing your face. Try silencing your face.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do.
So maybe just close it for now, since it's going there.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to let Akshara introduce Xoli. Just want to say that she's gone beyond being a friend. She is a sister. We've been friends for 25 years. So I'll be very biased if I introduce her. So I'm going to ask Akshar to introduce her. But before we go on that, I just want to let everyone know that this is Papo Live. Papo Live is the Portuguese in Portuguese, and it means live chat. It's a chat because it's a space that Akshar and myself created, under the various programs of our organizations. I run Semba Life Coaching, Consulting and Services, and Akshar runs his own organization, which is Tree of Life. We do similar work, and we've been working together for over 5 years almost, doing a lot of personal development work together from just everything. We do a lot of things together. And so we decided to create this space and invite our friends. I have a podcast. Akshar also has a podcast. And in those two spaces, we've been inviting professionals in the arena of personal development, of therapy, of, just people that are doing work or are teaching or are guiding or, doing something of support, of service to others. And so we decided that we wanted to have conversations with our friends, not just the ones who are doing the work professionally for personal development, therapy, or any kind of work of service, to the humankind. But we wanted to invite people who have done the work, who have put in practice everything that they've learned through therapy, through workshops, through trainings, through anything that they've chosen to do in order to grow and evolve. We wanted to invite those people to come and speak about their journeys, speak about their challenges, speak about their triumphs with everyone. Because very often what happens is there's a certain distance that is created, I think, mentally for many people when they meet people like me, they meet people like Akshar, or even any one of you who is a coach, or he's a psychologist, or he's a therapist of any kind. There's always this idea that we have done the work and we are superior, than everybody else, and we forget that we are also humans. So these conversations are also an opportunity for us to share of ourselves, share of our own journeys, our own struggles, our own challenges, our own triumphs with each other and with our guests. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the word to Akshar to introduce our guest for today and what we are talking about today. Over to you, Akshar.
All right, thank you. I'm also very interested in hearing what Xoli has to say about themselves. I got your bio, so I can read from it, but also I would like to hear more from yourself. So I know that Xoli grew up in rural Transkei. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. I'm sorry for any Mispronunciation. Transkei. Okay. And still considers themselves a village girl at heart. They love cooking for family and friends, yoga and running. So we have a lot of in common as well. Their parents divorced when they were 5, and from then on, their father was absent, showing up sporadically during their childhood and early adulthood. He passed on when they were 24. Regardless, their mother did all she could to ensure a sound grounding for them and their brother. Now, Xoli, as most people call them, is a business coach working with small businesses and NGOs to transform relationships with funders and investors. They are married, and their spouse is here, Jackie, so welcome. And they have 2 fur babies in the form of 2 cats named Jada and Willow. I loved their names. And I'm also a cat lover, by the way. And as of today, they completed their first half marathon. Yes. So this is what I got from the text, but I would like to hear from you, please, if you could.
Sure. I guess other than that, for me, I was trying to actually think as I was writing that bio. For me, I call myself just the liver of life. A permanent student. I'm always looking to somehow take what is sometimes difficult, sometimes mundane, sometimes joyous and, gratifying in life and really make it something meaningful, something that I can learn from, something that I can share with other people. I'm a firstborn, so in our culture, there is also a certain connotation with being a firstborn. We call them deputy parents. So that's why I do cats, because me and babies, I've babysat enough siblings and cousins, and I feel I've done my parenting journey already. So I stick with cats, which is fairly independent, but really, I never figured myself for a pet person. The thing that showed that to me was my spouse wanted to get pets. And I was like, I need something that's not going to be needing to be walked every day or cleaning tanks or, I don't have time for that. And cats are actually, our cats are fantastic. They're so loving. They're so entertaining. I think I know more about cats in the last 6 months than I ever thought I'd ever know. So that's a random fact. If you have anything about an ailment, a diet, any cat care kind of question, I think me and Dr. Google have done enough visits with one another that I feel very well-rounded in that subject.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good. Yes. I would also like to say that I'm very excited about this topic for someone who might be just popping in right now and doesn't know what we're going to talk about. It's about the father wound. It's a very important concept that I feel many of us are still not aware of it, but has great impact on our lives. So I'm very excited and curious to find out more about that.
Sure. Tina, you're on mute.
Yeah.
So when I asked Xolile if she would like to join us for these conversations, this topic came out of a conversation we were having, and she said, that's what I want to talk about, and so I just wrapped it into this title. We wrapped into the title, The Father Wound. There's actually a whole concept around father wound, but we wrapped it in the site because it was short title as well. Because it's a topic that is spoken about widely. A lot of people talk about this, especially in the West. There are a lot of conversations about that. I know that in South Africa also, there's a lot of research that has been done around fatherhood and all of that. But we wanted to have an intimate conversation, be beyond the numbers, beyond the cliche conversations. We wanted to have an intimate conversation. So going back to the question that Shara asked about who you are, what is it that you would like all of us to know about the initial moments of your experience with your father, that would sort of, give a nice background to this conversation?
Sure. I think first of all, maybe to start is to say, I only really became aware of my father wound very late in life, probably in my early 20s. Growing up, it was just a case of that my father wasn't around. And there was, whilst I was very aware, going to school and in other spaces, other people had dads. But I didn't really have access to them. And so there wasn't really a view of what fathered life was like.
Mm-hmm.
I use this for another analogy, but maybe it will work here. It's like if you grew up in a house where coffee or something like chicory coffee is what is drunk. You grow up thinking that's the taste of coffee. And so you don't know you're missing anything, right? Until someone makes you a cup of filter coffee. And then you realize what coffee, like proper ground coffee from a machine or a plunge or whatever, that's the moment you realize, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't coffee. This is coffee. And that moment for me happened in my 20s. And that was inside of observing my then girlfriend with their father, who was, as flawed a human being as anybody else and a great father. And for the first time, I thought, oh, this is what I was missing. There's a thing I came to see about women who had fathers in their lives, and it only really occurred to me when I reached my early 20s, as I was kind of defining who I am as a woman in my space in society. There was something very distinctly different about women who had good fathers, and I suddenly felt that missing for myself at that point in time. And so that's when I would say that I first experienced that father wound. For me, that's what I define it as. It's that gap, that hole that's left by not having a father. And you may not always be aware of it from the beginning. I know some children, they're asking from when they're 5, 6, like, where's my dad? Where's my dad? Or I wasn't that person. I knew where my dad was. He just wasn't in my life. And so I accepted that he's just not in my life until I realized pretty much at his funeral when that I didn't know my dad. I didn't know him at all. I didn't know what soccer team he follows, what kind of food he likes, just random things. Like I knew nothing of him. I had no sense of who he was as a person, other than the stories that I had heard through my childhood, either of him in varsity when him and my mother were dating, or obviously then the other stories about when, the marriage broke down, my father was abusive. And so that was also something that I carried with my father as an abusive man. That's just what I knew of him. And it was only really when I got to his funeral and afterwards that I thought I was reading some things in his obituary for the first time. And it was like reading the obituary of a stranger. And that's when it really kind of hit me, like, I didn't even have tears to cry. I didn't cry at my father's funeral. I felt like I was accompanying a friend to a family funeral, So it's been a journey for me, and it was also, I guess that was the first point where I kind of realized I had no idea who he was at all. And then later on in life, when I started doing the personal development work in my early 30s, I started exploring the idea of what like what was left of that relationship.
Mm.
And what I got for myself at the time, I thought I was angry with my dad because he wasn't around. I realized I'd forgiven my dad when he passed.
Mm.
And it was a huge surprise for me because I think the fact that there'd been no charge at his funeral, I started to release. My dad, besides being abusive, also had alcoholism as a disease, as well as diabetes. So those two diseases don't sit well together in a body, which is why he left us early. But I just got that disease was what had him do everything that he was doing.
Mm.
And I kind of made peace with that at the funeral. I wasn't present to it. I wasn't aware of it until I started doing the work and then examining actually the relationship itself. I've had to do far more work on my relationship with my mother than with my father, which is very, very interesting. I suppose because my mother is still alive and we're still in an active relationship. But I think because my relationship with my dad had been concluded, I also had laid it to rest at that point in time. But it took some work to then, after that realization, to build a relationship with him posthumously. Yeah. Maybe we'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing so honestly about things that are obviously very personal and also emotional. So thank you. Thank you. I always like to understand, maybe that's how my mind works, also in concepts and definitions. And I tend to think that maybe people would like to have a similar way of understanding. Let's say, how would you describe or define this father wound to people? To people who know nothing about the topic, who maybe or probably also have this wound, because I personally also found out about having one not so long ago, and it was more or less, I would say, randomly, because I wasn't looking for that in therapeutic work, and then I realized that I had that. So how would you define or describe to people who might not know anything about that, at least in theory, but maybe they also go through that or went through that at some point or are going through living with that?
For me, I think there's two types of father wounds.
Mm-hmm.
There's the father wound of the present father and the father wound of the absent father.
Okay.
And for me, mine is the one of the absent father. And it's that gap that, for whatever reason, nature decided you must have two parents. And so not having a parent in your life, for me, whether it's a mother or a father, that does create a gap. And it's about those conversations, those lessons, that wisdom that was only really available through that parent, so through a father. And for me as a woman, it really would have had an impact on my relationships with men in general. I had to do a lot of work about my relationships with men because I never learned how to relate. The first man that I loved left me. And so every man was a potential leaver. And so and no man could be trusted.
Yeah.
And so those were the conversations I had about men, and that was born out of that wound. It's about what stories we tell ourselves about the absence of our father. Because often as a child, you're not aware, you're not conscious, you're not in the conversations about everything that's going on that has your father be absent. So you fill in your gaps for yourself about why. And a lot of it sometimes becomes about me or them or some combination of both of us just not being meant to be together. I think that's what I told myself, was like, obviously as an abusive man, he wasn't meant to stay around. So better he's not there.
Yeah.
And then there's for me, the present father wound, the fathers who are in your life and at the same time are not doing fathering. I'll just put it under that general umbrella. There are men who are biological fathers. They are not fathering. They're not doing the parenting part of being a father. And yet they're present, and some of them get excused. Some of them, are like my dad, present but abusive. That in itself then can also create another story for you as a person to say, what happens when a father is dysfunctional?
Yeah.
And that's the bottom line, is really the father wound is what happens to a child when a father is dysfunctional in some shape or form.
All right.
Yeah. I wanted to come in and comment on that as well. And I would invite you to also do it, Akshar, because you also have a similar experience, a little bit of mine, a little bit of story.
Yes.
Okay. So
wait, I lost you for a second. Your connection broke.
Yes, I wanted to. I'm sharing, and then I would invite you to share on that as well.
I will.
Because I know that your story is somehow similar to mine and similar to Xoli's as well.
Yes.
In the sense that your father was not in the same space physically, but he was around, sort of, And so it's interesting when you bring up this, the experience of the father who is physically present in the same space, as us, yet not completely present, emotionally and all of that. My experience of my father was that he took on that role of the provider. My father was the provider, and for him, I grew up in a time of famine in the country. There was a lot of poverty and there was a lot of famine, and so the means, of subsistence were very, very low. And so I can imagine we were a family of 7 children. I was the youngest. I was the last born. So I was that one child that they made sure ate. Did she eat? She didn't hurt herself. As long as she has eaten, she won't die. That type of thing. And so the distance between me and my father was very, very long. I think when I was born, he was 45 years old. So imagine, by the time my cognition was somehow evolved, my father was already in his 50s almost. And so there was a huge age gap between us. And like you say, Xoli, I only realized much, much later in my life that I missed that relationship. Because there's one thing that I've heard, these words I didn't create it myself, but I've heard that the father, the parent of the opposite sex teaches us how people will love us, or how men will love us, or how people will love us. And the parent of the same sex teaches us how to love ourselves. And so what I remember was that my father was always medicated. He had high blood pressure. He had, diabetes, mild diabetes. So my father was always medicated. And so I don't know, and I can't remember many moments of emotional expression on his side. But I was always trying to get his attention. So I realized that the one thing that grabbed his attention was studying, so having good marks. So that was the one thing that, he prized me for. And so that was the thing that I did, and it became my winning formula in that relationship. And yet there was a huge gap in our relationship in regards to emotions, and how, and I only realized that much later in my relationships with men. I was always trying to fix them, because my father was always taking on medication. So I had this idea that when they are medicated, when they are being treated somehow, they can then look at me and see me, and and so it's interesting that, we all have this experience of the absent father somehow, because the experience doesn't look like what we desired. I think that will probably be the bottom line of this for me, is that I wished it was different. I wish I was the little princess, daddy's little princess, the one he called my princess, my sweet baby, my pumpkin, and all of that. And there was none of that in our relationship until much, much later, when he was, he was in his 70s, when he started calling us love and all of that. But throughout my childhood, and even when I was a teenager, I didn't experience, I had this huge yearning for, to be tapped in in my head, to be cuddled and all of that from him, and I didn't receive it. So I think it manifests, even when you have a father at home that provides, that pays for the bills, that sends you to school, that tells you that you're having a good mark, very good, and this and that. But then you would, as humans, we all have that socket that doesn't have a plug. And I think for me, it was that emotional connection with him. I didn't have that. So that was my father wound until I did the work and released him completely from that responsibility. Akshat.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, for me, this is always an interesting but also touchy topic. Okay, so in my case, I grew up in a house just full of women. My mom and my dad never lived together, so I used to see him maybe once a month, on the weekends, occasionally. So, like Holly said, to me it had always been like that. So I thought it's normal. I don't even miss him that much because this is how it's always been. But then I realized many years later that maybe that was also a defense mechanism, just so I wouldn't feel the absence so much. I told myself that it wasn't that important. So it was in an emotional freedom workshop, that's how it's called, when you also have to kind of look at what might be your childhood wounds, your mother and father wounds. And the facilitator, from what I was saying, maybe implied that I had that absence in me. I had that lack of the masculine side in my life, which I never realized that I actually had, or I couldn't agree that I had that. That I had that. But then I realized that through that, I had also learned that men are not to be trusted, because if he wouldn't stay with my mom, for example, men always leave, and they are also leaving out all their responsibility and all of those things. And it's always been much easier for me to like and trust women. Also, like in the parts that also to become friends with, because I always thought like, no, men are irresponsible, and they also, they leave people. You cannot trust them. I don't know. I think it's not so easy to sum up so much, but one thing that I could say is that I realized that I was also rejecting part of my own male energy, because I believe that all of us, we have male and female energy. And I was partially or partly rejecting that also, because I was rejecting the idea of men as being something good and trustworthy and loving. For example, I think it's always, it's only been lately that I learned to take the initiative and hug my dad, for example. And it felt weird. He's still around. He's one of the kindest people I know, but he's always been kind of distant and absent. So to hug my own father was something weird at first, which is happening more often. But I realize now, after a lot of introspection and self-work, that I've always carried this wound without knowing. And now I know about it, and I'm also trying to work on it and trying to change a little bit the narrative. But I think now with sharing, I also will share a question that intrigues me. I would like to hear your opinion. Do you think everyone has a father wound, for example, to some extent, or are there really cases of functional fathers and successful fathers, or father histories? Because it's something that I'm curious about, honestly. All right, that's it.
I'll jump in there and I'll say I want to believe that there are fathers out there who are doing the best that they can. And at the same time, we are human beings. And so I don't think, even in my relationship with myself, I have been imperfect. And so in my relationship with others, by default, I have been imperfect. However, I do believe that there are certain father-child relationships that are really built on, somebody having taken an interest in you as a child early on and taken on their responsibility of fathering you and taken that seriously. I don't think there's anyone who will ever say, but I do believe that there is a and I've seen it. I mean, even within my own friend circle, for instance, I do see some men that I would call good fathers, present, attentive, giving the right amount of discipline, and stability and security and challenge. I think that's something for me that actually is a key part, that is an element of a good fathering relationship. Your father should challenge you. Your mother nurtures you. Your father should challenge you to define yourself, to spread your wings. And I guess this is my magic formula of a father, and be that person who says, go for it, I'm here.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was speaking to when I said I noticed the difference in those people who had good fathers. They had that approach to life. They were risk takers. They were, but very risk takers, and also able to demand of life of others because they had a different sense of self-worth. There was just something where you've come from a relationship with a good father who's done all of these things, your approach to life is different.
That you're supported.
You feel, there's a thing where when you feel supported with a good dad and somebody that, whatever happens in life, I can call my father. Even when we were young, the people who could call their dad to come and fetch them when the party got nasty. Knowing that we were not meant to be where we are right now. And at the same time, I can call my dad to come fetch me anytime. That to me is like, that's the power of a father. Like, you can go out in life and go and do things and know that there's someone who's rooting for you. There's someone who's there to catch you if you should fall.
Those are very powerful words, Xoli. And I wanted to actually piggyback on something that you said earlier when you were talking about your father, that connects very well with what you just shared now, which is this idea of fathers as human beings, and how are they themselves, how have they been raised, what's the word? Raised. So how have they been raised, and how have they been taught, this skill? Because they themselves were children as well, and I know for a fact, because of the work that I do and because I'm a mother, that very early in life, we start making up the stories about ourselves and who we are and how we show up to the world and all of that. So both the negative and the positive. I always tell my children that there's a chatterbox in our minds that keeps telling us, this is your fault, this is your fault, you're a bad child. And so I wanted to piggyback on that, on this backgrounds of our fathers, who raised them, for them to become who they are, who raised our fathers, and so were they in safe environments? Did they receive what they needed in order to feel that they were capable of being fathers? I know a lot of men, even in my family, that do not take on those responsibilities of being fathers. I don't know, out of fear of failure. I don't know what exactly happens. And I know actually also do a lot of work on masculinities, and you can jump in, talk about that. But I wanted to come back to you, Xolile, and talk a little bit about this, like who raised these fathers, to the point that, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, your father, when you were born, your father was really young. He was a young man, very young. He was in his early 20s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was in his mid to late 20s.
Yeah.
That's one of the mysteries, actually, is like, what is my father's actual birthday? I'm not clear on that. What I saw in the obituary and what I'd known all my life were two different things. So, but when you say sorry, just repeat your question. I just lost that.
Who raised this man that then become absent fathers,
So for me, I can't ever, and it's one of those things that people maybe will lambast me for. But my father was the child of a mine worker, as far as I could make out. A mine worker who possibly came from Mozambique, actually, and was traveling between Mozambique and Johannesburg. That's where my father was born, in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I have not a single clue.
Yeah.
And so our parents were raised by a generation of either people who were still working the land, in my case, the early professionals of, the Black community, or mine workers. Yeah. I think those were probably the if we were to put maybe three broad categories of people who raised our parents. My dad in particular, as far as I could make out, was the father of a mine worker. Now that is a very distinct setup, in that you have a lot of dysfunction that was built deliberately into the family system by corporations who wanted to have cheap labor available in their mines at all times.
Yeah.
The idea of the sanctity of the African family was non-existent at the time that my father was born. These were men who were being paid to go and deliver their labor, and were coming home, most of them once, sometimes twice a year if they were lucky. And so my father's mother, I know very, very little about her, actually. But it was my father's aunt who ended up raising him. So he grew up in a family with cousins, and there's all that dynamic. I don't know how well, as far as I can make out, it's a healthy, functioning family. However, like you said, as we grow up, there are stories that we'll tell ourselves. Even growing up inside of a healthy family when you don't come from one can be an issue.
Yeah.
As you know, my father was an altar server when he was a teenager. He, for all intents and purposes, was walking the straight and narrow right up until he hit university. And then things went wobbly after that.
Yeah.
And so there's so many questions. I don't, as much as I think as much stability as was possible was provided to him, I suspect, looking at how his life turned out later, that he probably had a deep challenge about belonging.
Powerful.
And that would have been impossible to build a functioning romantic or family relationship with as a viewpoint.
Yeah.
I don't belong is not going to keep you inside of your family or inside of your relationship.
Yeah. Very powerful words, Xoli. You know, Brené Brown speaks a lot about that, that, human beings are constantly looking for love and belonging, love and belonging. And it's so interesting what you're saying, because my father grew up with this. He had his mother was the second wife of my grandfather. And so they lived in the compound because my grandmother was lobola. They paid lobola for her, and she lived in the same compound. However, what had happened was that my dad, first of all, my grandfather paid lobola for this second wife of his with money from his sister's lobola. So as he was growing up, his cousins used to tease him about that. And he took it very personal until he was late. I mean, he was in his 50s, 60s, and 70s. He always talked about that with a wound, and made him feel inferior to these cousins of his who didn't even complete, primary education. And my father was a nurse. He lived in a very well, lower middle class area and all of that. But he still had this wound of feeling inferior to his cousins. In addition to that, his father abandoned that compound and went and married another woman who he didn't bring into the compound. And so my father also had the wound of being abandoned until he's, close to his last breath. He was still holding on that. So can you imagine what he was unable to give to us because he didn't feel like he belonged, and so it's interesting how this conversation about the father wound, it doesn't stop with us. We actually have to have the courage to look back at what happened to our parents as well. What are their stories, and not in, especially for the ones who had very abusive fathers, for instance. This is not to say that what they did was right, but it helps us to heal when we understand where they have come from. I don't know what you all think.
Yeah, if I may, I'm finding it very interesting to realize that, like you said, Xoli, it's a big umbrella. So maybe it's going to look different to each of us, because in my case, I didn't grow up in the physical presence of my father, like I said. Even though he grew up in with his mom and dad together until now. I still have my paternal grandparents alive, and they are very close to each other. But the justification that I had to find for myself to also kind of deal with this, or try to deal with this in a conscious way, and not just in that, because I think many of us, we just think of our fathers and mothers as heroes, perfect, or as the villains. Usually it's one of these extremes.
Yeah.
For me not
Yeah.
to stay one of these extremes, I try to look for a justification. And I think my grandfather always also did what he could, but always under this umbrella of what a man should do. There's a theory that says that masculinity is also always associated with 3 P's. One is paternity. That, yeah, if you can be a father, just make people like you give life first. Paternity and protection. The role of a man should also be something like to protect physically and in every way their children, and providing, provision, like what Tina was saying, provide financially and in other ways. So I think my grandfather did that, but it seems to me that there always lacked some sort of emotional connection. So seeing that I didn't grow up with my dad and he wasn't at home to provide, protect, and to really parent, I think maybe he didn't know what else to do. Because if that's what a man should do, and there's nothing more that is expected, for example, to be emotionally present, to care, to be interested, to be curious, then I think that's this justification that I found. My dad said, okay, I am already his father, so whenever we meet, we're going to have this father and child conversation. Each of us will play their role. So I'm the father, he's the child. And also one thing that I noticed, because I still try to observe my dad's and my granddad's relation, is that in our culture, I think it's very asymmetrical. So instead of, for example, being like, I'm your father, but I'm a human being, and you are my son and also a human being, and we both have limitations, imperfection. I think the way we are taught, look at our fathers, is that it's always, how can I say, looking upwards as something that is always unreachable. And I think to some people in general, but also to some men in particular, it leaves them with the impression that they will never be anything like their fathers, and they feel not enough. They feel like, okay, since I'll never be like my dad, there's not so much that I could do. But that's escaping their own responsibility of learning how to do that themselves, you know? I don't know if this makes any sense, but I think that's more or less how I try to assimilate this story and this wound. And because the initial idea, before I ever realized that I had this father wound and that I realized that I had to do some work, I had this idea that he just didn't love me enough, or I was just not enough. And then I realized that maybe it's not really about me. Of course, it affects me, but it's not about me. The how much he can or he cannot father is also his responsibility, and maybe how much he is or was willing to work on it, but not necessarily targeted at me, you know. So I think in a way that also kind of helps to leave that idea of victimhood, like he just doesn't love me or I'm not enough. No, it's also his limitation, you know. Yeah, those are some of the ideas that are running around here still.
I want to take an opportunity because there's such a beautiful little segue that you provided there, Aksha. When you talked about we'll call it the functions of a father: paternity, protection, provision. And one of the conversations that, or how part of this conversation had actually evolved with Tina, was also inside of the fact that often God is referred to in the masculine. And actually, those things, as you said them to me, are also my idea of who God is for me: protector, provider, paternity. I am a child of God, you know. And so there's something in there that's just so interesting about how, when you talked about then, you know, you made up the story about your dad, instead of actually looking at, well, this was his limitation as a parent and this is what he was able to provide. Some of it became about you and you not being enough and him not caring about you. That's the story that comes up for me in conversations about God, in that, you know, my relationship to God has actually been shaped by my relationship with my father. The level to which I trust that God will provide has only transformed after I transformed my view of my dad. Because as I was growing up, for me, God was an entity out there. And I do remember as a child, in the moments when I did feel like I wish my dad was here. One of the things that my grandmother had taught me, my grandmother was a very religious woman, had taught me, well, God is your father. And so in the moments where I did feel like I wish my dad was here, then I would turn to God and I'd literally climb onto my bed as if I was climbing into my dad's lap and curl up into a little ball and talk to God and pray, I guess. I mean, as well as a 5-year-old knows what praying is, but I would pray and ask for things, and then those things wouldn't materialize. And so God became just like my dad in that, you know, I could ask my dad for things, but most of the things didn't materialize. And it became that kind of, it's because I'm not good enough story. My dad doesn't care, God doesn't care, what I want doesn't matter because I'm not good enough to provide for. I'm not good enough to protect. You know, I went through a period in school where I was bullied, and I'd pray and I'd cry to God. Why is this happening to me? And when it didn't stop, part of that blame sat with God. So there's something for me very crucial in doing the work. Because until we make peace with our human source, it's difficult to make peace with our creative source.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I could actually dare to say that for many of us, I mean, until I also learned that lesson, and we had a very powerful conversation, Xoli and I, we normally have a coaching session where she coaches me, I coach her.
Oh, we lost Tina for a second.
And then we do the work that we're supposed to be doing like an hour late. Now?
Yes, we got you. I think we lost you just where you were saying we have coaching sessions, you coach me and I.
Yes, we just have these very long and very interesting conversations about this, and that's when we came to this conversation about the relationship we have with the Creator and the relationship we have with our fathers. Because in most cultures, you know, most spiritual cultures of the world, I can dare to say most religions, God is referred to as a father, you know, as a Lord, as a king, you know, and in the human mind, the mind is not able to differentiate between the king that is a creator that is invisible and the king that is on earth. We kind of, you know, project the same way we see a king, we project into the creator. When we see a father, we project into the father, who is the Father God. The mind is not, and the brain is not able to separate. And so I like what you are sharing, Xoli, and I'll probably invite everyone who's on the call with us and anyone who's going to watch this afterwards. Think about that. Think about how, if you are of some kind of religion, you know, of any religion, if you are spiritual anyway, what do you project into this creator? What is the image? What is the human image that you project into this creator? And then evaluate, how do you relate to this image? How do you relate? If you see God as God the mother, how do you relate to mothers? You know, if you how do you relate to authority, fathers? Because it won't be different. Father is passed now as well for almost 10 years. And what I've seen also is that when I finally post-mortem, I did my healing, my complete healing with my father post-mortem, my relationship with God, the creator, has become much more intimate, because I no longer project my father onto him, because my father is not here, and so there has been a shift as well in how I relate to God, the creator. And I can refer to God as a mother sometimes, because that's what I feel. I can relate to God as a father. I don't call God the Lord, the King. No, I really have a childlike relationship. And probably sometimes I even project what I desired to have with my father and I didn't have. And I've used the opportunity because I've done the work, And so I just wanted to offer this to everyone who is with us today and probably listening. Reflect on that, on what Xoli is sharing. Akshar?
Awesome. I'm really mind blown in the most positive way to be part of this conversation. Talking about the image of God. I also wanted to say that for me, I'll go back to that, but the idea of strength has always been associated with the feminine in my case. My mom has always, I think now I realize that she had to overcompensate as well, but she has always been for me the image of masculine and feminine together in a very powerful and beautiful, how can I say, configuration. And the idea of responsibility and strength and all of those things has always been associated with my mom, for example, and also of life giving and life sustaining as well. So I dare say that I also grew up in under the influence of Christianity and then Islam, which are both patriarchal religions that see God as made, even though at least in Islam they used to say that God doesn't have a human form, but nonetheless we always refer to God in the masculine, also father, very similar. But to me, God is both, is the balance and the combination of male and female. So to me, God is father, God is mother, and also at the same time beyond both. It's non-binary. It's what's beyond our projections. Yes, even though our projections, they really help us make sense of the world and how we relate to ourselves, to others, but that the true godliness, in my opinion, is beyond, includes both, but is beyond both at the same time. And in those reflections, there are always questions that come to me. And Xoli, since we realized late in life that we had these wounds, it really interests me to ask you, how could people also realize if they're living with these wounds or not? But not just that, because if you don't know what is hurting you, you cannot identify it, you cannot call it, but you know it hurts, it's one step behind. But then you know what it is, but it's also not solved. So how can we identify, but also how can we deal with this in a healthy way so that we're not also stuck in the idea that, okay, look at me, poor me, I have this wound, and what can we do? What can be done? How can we identify this in our daily lives and what can be done?
I think for me to identify it, first you need to get curious.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our life is lived from default.
Yes.
And so until you get curious about some of the things that you've always held to be true, you won't make that discovery. And it's in simple little things. Look at your relationships with men. Look at your conversation about men. And look at how you relate to men. For me, although I had my father missing, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather was always present and is that rock. I mean, he just turned 100. So like, it's he's been there.
Amazing. It's amazing.
Right.
Hats off to him.
Yes.
Listen, and it's really in that, in first getting curious about when I am in my head by myself, what am I saying about men? When I see a post on social media that says men are trash, am I like, yeah, true, true, true? Or is there something that sits uncomfortable? It will sit in that space because, like Tina said, I think I do believe that idea that, you know, the parent of the opposite sex teaches you how to relate to that sex in general.
Yeah.
And so if that wound is present, you will find that there are certain conversations you have about men that are not complementary, that are not healthy. And by healthy, I mean, when you're not really able to see a whole human being, there's something about their gender that filters the way that you see them. I think that would be one way for me to really to invite people to look at how do you relate to men? If you're a woman, when you're with your girlfriends, what do you say about men? If you're a guy, when you're with your guy friends or whatever kind of friends, what are the thoughts? How do you behave with each other? You know, is hugging okay? Do you show affection to one another? Is it all about being macho and strong? And, you know, there's something there. Once you don't see a whole human who's able to make mistakes, who's trying just the way that you are, there's something there.
Yeah, awesome. If I may add something about how I see that men usually behave around each other, among each other, is that even if they're moving in groups of men that they like or love and trust, there's always this feeling of not feeling safe enough to just be, you know, to be vulnerable, so it's like a group of men together, moving together, but not trusting each other enough to be who they really are and to share what they really feel. Because out of fear that I will not be understood, I will be made fun of, or cast aside, or something like that. So I just wanted to add this because sometimes out of our unconsciousness, we may feel like, no, I relate just fine with other men because I'm always with other men watching soccer and having beers, whatever. But then deep down, like, can I really feel safe among them enough to just be myself and to feel, yeah, that we love each other, not as beings, and we're not just playing roles, for example, like you said, the macho man or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just maybe as a tiny little anecdote, I have seen a couple of friends, like, just like really, for me, it stood out. These guys hadn't seen each other since varsity or whatever, and were meeting after 20 years. And the embrace and the laughter and the one picking the one up and swinging him around, it was such a beautiful, joyous, unadulterated, unfiltered joy to be with one another. That is unusual to witness between men, and it's one of the reasons why it's stuck in my memory. It's like one of those, when I think of a healthy relationship between men, those are those guys are people I imagine.
Yeah, and also there's the silences as well. There's actually a very interesting documentary on YouTube on the silence of men. The silences are also, for me, I think they are a sign of how your relationship with your father was for men. You know, are you able to even speak your emotions? Are you able to speak your thoughts without the fear that there will be reprehension because of the way you said it, because of the way you showed up? You know, if you are in school and another child beats you up and you come home and you tell your father that you were beaten up, what was his reaction? Did he call you stupid? Did he hit you in the head? Did he call you weak? And then you started, you know, moving through life with this self-fulfilling prophecy that I'm weak, I'm stupid. And that even turned you into a person who is constantly on a defensive mode, where you have to always be aggressive towards others in order to protect yourself. For me, those are also signs that there's something there, you know, and I love what you're saying, Xoli. It's about curiosity. It's about awareness, you know, being present to how am I living my life? You know, this is one of my top questions as a coach. You know, how are you showing up in the world? How are you showing up for yourself? You know, how are you showing up, you know, in your relationships? That is already a sign that there's something that needs your attention. And it's an opportunity for you to decide, do I want to continue to live my life this way, or do I seek support? You know, because we can't do these things on our own, you know. So we coming closer to the end of our chat, and I wanted to ask Akshar, do you have, before we do that last question, is there something else we wanted to ask Claudia to talk about as we start wrapping up this talk?
I don't think it's going to be any different question, maybe just an insistence. Not that I'm not getting answers. I'm just trying to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. That's all. For example, the father wound. Is it something that we can really heal from, or we just learn to cope with it in a way that doesn't affect our life so much? And yeah, just if you have any further how can I say, suggestions, ideas on how to identify and deal with it. I'm also writing it down here for myself and for others. That's it.
No, I think it is something that you can heal to a large degree. It really, for me, depends on your willingness to dig. And your willingness to dig deep into two things. One is understanding, the other one is compassion.
Yeah.
And if you can allow yourself the space to have that compassion, once again, for me, it's that space that you can own that I am a fallible human being, and yet God loves me just the way that I am. And so if God loves me, why wouldn't he love my father?
Yes.
Potentially, you know, a route that one would take, particularly if you're of a religious persuasion, the idea of compassion, grace, mercy, these are all values that can help you along that journey of healing that wound. And really, one thing for me is not getting significant. And it's hard for some people. And it's not to belittle, because the wounds are different sizes and they've been in existence for different reasons. And so I'm not saying that there's an automatic free pass that, you know, you're supposed to give your parent. And at the same time, for me, at least, and I can only speak for myself really, and say what has worked for me is really getting really interested and curious about him as a person, and owning my own fallibility. You know, I can say, oh, okay, but my transgressions weren't anywhere near his. Yes. And maybe not. And so what?
Yeah.
In the end, he lived a life where he was denied the opportunity to love and interact with two awesome human beings, which I believe my brother and I are. He missed out on that. He really didn't get to know us. We didn't get to know him. And I don't know anybody who would have been okay going to their grave like that. And that's what he got. He went to his grave never actually having developed a relationship with his children. And that to me is one of the saddest things ever. And in then doing the work for myself and then dismantling the stories. So the second part is really about understanding and compassion for him as a parent and a human being. And then dismantling the stories I told myself about why he wasn't around. Dismantling the story of I'm not good enough, dismantling the story of he didn't want me, dismantling, the stories I heard about him being told in the family and, and clearing my space of that. And it takes time. It's not something that I think, you can switch on and switch off. And it might, for some people, that wound is a little bit like grief. And grief for me was explained in a beautiful way. Somebody said, grief is like a big ball in a box when it starts. And every time you move through life, the box shakes and the ball touches the edges and each time it touches the edge, that's when you feel the pain of the grief. And I think for some people, when you first discover that father wound, it's like that. It's like now you're aware of it and it's a constant trigger. And as you do the work, the ball gets smaller and smaller. So as you move through life, the ball touches the sides of the box less and less and less. And it may not actually end up gone completely. But it may be that ball that's so small that it only after a while will touch the wall once every 4 years or once every 10 years, because what also I got for myself, my dad was actually present at some key critical moments at my life. Times when I needed him to be present. And he didn't ask questions. He just showed up. He did what I needed him to do. And then he disappeared again. But in that moment when there was no way forward except for his intervention in this situation, he actually did show up. And so those were moments for me where I could say, if I didn't have a dad, because sometimes there's that story, right? You're like, I wish he didn't even exist then. I mean, but actually, I'm grateful. Because I don't know if I would have reached the level of compassion I have for human being if I hadn't gone through that. And that compassion for human beings starting with me, like me. Do it for yourself first, not for anybody else. Really, that's the keys. I did it for me, not for him. I needed the peace. And so, yeah.
Powerful, very powerful, very powerful. There's nothing more to add actually to what you, you said. You said it so beautifully, and I loved how you end this by saying, I'm grateful, because there's so much gratitude towards these beings, they offered their part of themselves, in order for us to be here. They allowed themselves to be a vehicle through which we came here. So gratitude is a very powerful word to use there. Thank you so much, Xolile. I wanted to offer to you a question that was left by our first guest. And we are going to do this. Actually, I saw it in another podcast and I thought it was lovely, that carries the conversation forward. And we asked our first guest, what would you like us to ask our next guest? And her question was, are you, correct me if I'm wrong, are you where you desire to be in your life in this right now moment?
I mean, I just ran 21 kilometers, so I feel pretty accomplished right now.
Oh, yeah.
I work on being that all the time.
Mm.
I know that when I feel like I'm not where I'm meant to be, that thought is false.
Yeah.
And I seek always to come back to the present moment. The trusting of the unfolding of life is what I'm working on. So am I where I want to be in my journey? I would say yes. And there's a lot more that I'd love to experience.
Yeah. Beautiful. Living in the world of infinite possibilities.
Amen. Amen.
And so what question would you leave for our next guest?
My question for our next guest would be, if you had one thing that you could look back on your life and go, no, let me rephrase that. What was the most significant turning point up until now? And why?
That's
what was that moment where you had an aha moment and it was like, whoa, completely changed your mindset about something? And it could be in a conversation with someone, it could be something you read, studied, experienced, whatever. But what is it that has been a breakthrough for you and that you're still using that lesson today?
Delicious question.
Very, very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Xoli, and thank you everyone who joined us. We are going to invite you all to drop your questions on my Facebook page, and also on the Facebook page of Temba Life Coaching, Consulting and Service, and Tree of Life. Also, we're going to place the video there as well. We want to continue this conversation. We have run out of our time. However, if there's anyone on a call that would like to ask a question, make a comment, this is the time. This is, I see Liz. Liz has been raising her hand like for a while. Yes, Liz, you can come in, come on. Yes.
I want to ask about, perfect place to ask about ancestors. Now, Akshar said earlier, what can be done? Now, what the African people have taught me is to talk to the ancestors, and I'm finding it mind-blowing. And I want to bring that to England, to Europe, because it's so missing. But you guys grow up in this soup of, you have your soul, you have a soul, you're unique. Each baby has a lullaby, the mother sings. There's something like you have a dance with God. I feel you have a very particular relationship to God because you're African, because you're on Mother Earth. Mother for me is Earth, and Father, Son. That's how I see it. It's big, right? So can we go to the ancestors and improve our relationship with Father?
That's a beautiful question. Very beautiful question. Does anyone want to jump into that? I have a lot to say, but I would like to give you.
Or maybe we could do a whole new webinar on just
absolutely.
that.
Oh my God, you just gave us an idea there.
I agree.
Definitely.
And I'll bring my English friends and you bring your African friends, and we can really work with the ancestors across the globe, right? Make his energy like huge to enter the whole opportunity of healing. I feel the ancestors have so much to give us, and we have to forgive and be compassionate, just like you said, Polly. We have to be compassionate and forgive them, and then they'll heal the next generation. But tell me.
I'll do a two-liner. For me, the relationship with the ancestors can really be healed by bringing them into your present moment in every moment. my family's animal totem is a bee.
Mm.
And one thing that you'll see in my house, there'll be bees in the middle of winter. And I believe that's when the ancestors come to visit.
Wow, that's beautiful. And you're the
so-
queen bee, right?
Does look
Yeah.
like the queen bee today.
Queen bee, woo! We were the
I
workers.
think, yeah, I definitely think for me, the key is bring them into your present. Ask them questions, engage them in your life. I have conversations with my dad. I count him as an ancestor now that he's late. And I feel him, I experience him in different moments. If we take the tradition that we are spirit having a human experience, then ancestors are accessible in any given moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just the whole concept of ancestors is, it doesn't belong to the Africans, it belongs to the world, because if you see, every religion has this idea, and even the way we speak about death, it's not definite. There's this idea of rest in peace. You're not referring to a body, you're referring to a soul that is going through another journey, and
Mm.
it could be laying, or it could be in transition. And so in that process of resting in peace, what we are desiring is that as you transition, you don't continue with any suffering. You don't take anything from this plane into the other plane. You simply move into a new experience of peace, which can be found in anywhere, in the, electromagnetic fields. And so for me, I think that belongs to all of us, it belongs to the whole humanity, this idea that, we don't end with death, we continue, through these other energies, that are either around us or have transitioned into other levels of existence. And so that is humanity for me in general. And when it comes to what we are talking about, the fathers, I think the process of healing our relationships with our fathers, especially for some of us who have lost, whose fathers have transitioned, there's also a healing of a whole line of relationships with fathers, because my father brought in his relationship with his father, and his father probably brought in his relationship with his father. And so it never sort of ends, it just continues. And I think the curiosity that Xoli very well talked about is, how can I then interrupt a certain pattern, in these relationships, in this experience of fatherhood, or this experience of being a child of a father? How do I interrupt the discourse or the narrative I've been carrying so far, so that the next generation is no longer continuing with a certain pattern that has been carried through generation and generation? And if you look at the African context, we went through, some kind of civilization. Then we had, centuries of colonialism, and then we're still moving out of colonialism. And so there were, this, imagine like 400-500 years of confusion between what is our spiritual practice, and what is the spiritual practice that we have adopted from those who came, and how do we then continue to carry on that which, grounds us, and continues to make us who we are in this land, versus what we've been offered by those who came, which also has its value. So I think it's a very interesting conversation, which we're going to put in our list, because we want to continue these conversations. But I think it's a very powerful one, because the healing that we're doing now, it's probably not for now. It's probably from centuries back, of people who needed us to interrupt something today. So those would probably be my contribution.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah. And Akshar, what do you say? Just got to ask him as well.
Actually, I'm so satisfied and happy to be here today, because I think it's been a while since I was in this place of actually listening and absorbing so much. I'm really, really in a good space right now. And I think for now, there's not so much I would add. I definitely agree that we are a continuation our ancestors, and also the materialization of so much that they wished for themselves and for the generations after them, that we are right now playing that part. And I think for now, I'll just take all of these questions and just really let them
Yeah.
let them sink in and just really see how we can bring this topic again very soon. Yeah, I kind of got speechless right now, but in the best way. The best way. I think these questions arose. This conversation, in general, it arose a lot of things in me that needed to be dug up, and I'm really thankful for that. Yeah, so gratitude is what I'm feeling right now, and yeah, I don't have any conclusions for the moment. Maybe that's what I can say.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Liz, for bringing that topic. And we want to say thank you, Xoli, for your time. We know that you ran 21 kilometers today, and you still made it to this conversation. Thank you so much for allowing your inner authority to guide you into this space.
You mean my spouse?
Yes, congrats to you too, Jackie.
Yeah, you look absolutely beautiful, so radiant and beautiful today. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you everyone who joined us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me the space
Such
to
a beautiful
share.
encounter.
Thank you. And thank you, Aksha. Like, your questions really got me.
Yes.
It was
good.
actually beautiful how the interplay between, like, as I was having a thought, you'd ask a question about it. So it was really great.
Beautiful. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely week.
Conversation.
Beautiful.
Cheers.
Jackie and everyone. We meet you in, I think, in about a month, because our next conversation will be in Portuguese. If you want to join, you are welcome. Okay.
Oh,
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
bye.
Bye.